there everyone, this is Dan Dix here reporting for Press for Truth, and this is the truth about Russia and NATO. Now, under the neoconservative government of Stephen Harper, the Cold War mentality against Russia has increased by tenfold. Russia's foreign ministry even mentioned Ottawa by name. In response to sanctions on Russia, they said, "We advise Washington and Ottawa to think about the consequences of such actions. Meanwhile, we will work on retaliatory measures." Sanctions are clearly an act of war, and the offensive stance that the West has taken against Russia and anti-NATO forces in Ukraine will likely lead to an actual shooting war. But how did we get here? How can I call someone like Vladimir Putin the good guy while the West, including my home country of Canada, as the bad guys? Well, if you're not blinded by nationalism, it's pretty easy to make sense of the situation. It starts with the Ukraine. Governed from Kiev, the Western-friendly politicians are losing consent of the masses day by day. First they lost Crimea, now they're losing Donbass, yet the West is persistent with getting the Ukraine into NATO. If this happens, a war with Russia will be inevitable. Back in 1990, when the Soviet Union agreed to let East Germany escape Soviet control, the agreement was that NATO would not push east into former Soviet satellites. The agreement was that there would always be a buffer zone between the West and Russia. Well, despite agreeing to this exchange, US and NATO broke their pledge almost immediately. NATO is now in Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, and the US-led alliance is literally creeping up against Russia's borders. US anti-missile systems are in Poland, and new US bases have been built in Bulgaria, Romania, and Central Asia. And yet, Russia is supposed to be the aggressor here. See, it's clear that NATO has become the Fourth Reich. Not that Russia or Putin are perfect, but clearly this is one of those live and let live situations. So Putin is a homophobe that doesn't allow free speech. Okay, well, why should Canada intervene? What exactly is it about Putin's leadership that interferes with the daily lives of Canadians? Well, nothing exactly. The fact is that NATO is not equipped to go to war over the Ukraine. Russia has the home turf advantage, and no one in Europe, aside from Ukrainian nationalists, want a war with Russia. The loudest voices for war are the neocons in Washington and Ottawa, who of course are safely separated by 8,000 kilometers of mostly ocean. Not to mention, it won't be Harper or Obama going to war, but rather the brave men and women who have unfortunately been brainwashed and conditioned into believing that they are actually fighting for our freedoms. See, there is no economic benefit to putting any kind of sanctions on Russia. In fact, it hurts Canadian exporters and it targets individual Russian citizens. There's no national security risk from Russia. The Ukraine is just simply not a place worth going to war over. Just imagine if the Ukraine could exercise self-determination. Wouldn't that be truly democratic? Instead, we have these so-called democratic Western leaders promoting their militarized version of democracy. It's the same vision that they had for Egypt and Libya and Iraq, and just look at how those thriving democracies are doing. The fact is, there's no evidence that links Russia with revolution in Ukraine. The evidence actually says the opposite. The US has spent nearly $5 billion for a regime change in the Ukraine. There's also no evidence to label the Crimean referendum illegal, as Stephen Harper has done. In fact, thanks to the robocalls, or the in-and-out scandal, there's less legitimacy for Harper's majority government than there is for Crimea's separation. And when talking about the legality of elections, well, Stephen Harper is the pot calling the kettle black. The fact is, the US and NATO took an internal Ukrainian conflict, and by intervening on the side of anti-Russian Ukrainians, Well, they made a mountain out of a molehill and incited what could be a potential nuclear showdown between the West and Russia. Now, none of this should be really all that surprising, though. Russia has a long history of protecting its national interests. But more importantly, at the latest Bilderberg meeting, it was reported that Russia was a major topic of interest. See, Putin and Russia are not craving into the demands of the New World Order. They, along with Iran and China, are rejecting the dollar-dominated empire that the central bankers have been implementing for over 100 years now. And so then what of the Russian economy? Well, if you've listened to nothing but the corporate state media, you'd think that the Russian economy is collapsing and that the West is doing just fine. Well, it may be true that the Russian economy isn't looking so hot, but at least they're taking all the necessary steps towards correction. In response to the decline of crude oil prices, the Russian central bank has actually raised interest rates. And the Russian central bank also has gold on reserve, as well as some other currencies, such as the Canadian loonie. The Federal Reserve, on the other hand, has no exit strategy. They can't raise interest rates without imploding the world economy, and they have zero gold reserves. And along with the decline of crude oil, which the Russian economy depends on, all efforts by the West have been aimed to cause civil unrest in Russia in attempts to overthrow the Putin regime, and in his place, hopefully a CFR-friendly globalists. But like any wounded animal backed into a corner, the Russian bear can be vicious. We have to remember Russia is a nuclear powerhouse, and globalist infiltration of China isn't rock solid. There is a power dynamic between the West and the East, and our Western leaders have been on top for so long that they're getting pretty cocky now. Cocky and quite dangerous. And of course, while true power sits with the banking dynasties that have financed and armed both sides of this conflict, there is no money to be made and no power new vacuums to be filled without conflict. The global elite depend on the West hating Russians and Russians hating the West. But as Canadians or Americans or wherever you reside, unless the individual masses, unless we make our voices heard and demand that these wars of aggression stop, unless we do something to end this New World Order, then we are just simply a part of the problem. So thanks for tuning in today, folks. Please be sure to subscribe to us here on YouTube if you haven't already, and check the links in the description to where you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also show your support by signing up at patreon.com/pressfortruth or becoming a member at pressfortruth.tv. And stay tuned, folks. We're going to have a lot more video reports coming out very soon to pressfortruth.ca.